Charlene, can you start by telling me a bit about you as a person, a human, a woman?
Hi, I'm Charlene. I'm originally from New York City, grew up in Chinatown, Manhattan, and now I'm in Lisbon in Portugal. And I do often lead by saying that I'm a certified grief coach, a speaker, and the curator of the grief gallery, because I feel like that's so woven into who I am at this point. As a human, I'm a creative, I'm an artist, I love food, I'm motivated by food. My home is full of art and stuffed animals and a very full pantry. And I've always been obsessed with objects, stories, language, words, and I'm an only child. So I spent a lot of time in my head, and I still do, and I really enjoy that. Well, as a daughter, and this is, of course, the start of my grief journey and my personal introduction into deep loss and that experience. My mother, Marilyn, she died 10 years ago, January 2013. Actually, 10 years ago today. So this is the exact date. And it was very sudden. She had a stroke. And at the time, she was living in New York. She had moved back to New York from California. And I was living in London. And I mean, as you can imagine, that changed everything. That changed everything about my life as it was. And it changed the trajectory of my life. Daughter of Marilyn.
What do you typically do on the anniversary, or what are you doing this year? Is there a way that you mark it, or do you make a point not to?
I'm very aware of January. Like I've kind of described it as it's this month that just feels like it's dipped in grief. I like a chocolate ganache, like a whole month. And but January's always been a challenging month anyway, because when I was working with designers and makers and I was doing exhibitions, December would always be really intense because we would have our pop-up shops, we would do the Christmas shopping and all the holiday kind of events. So January was always a time when I would kind of crash anyway and kind of had to plan for that. And then after my mom died, January took on this different kind of heaviness where for the first couple of years, I just kind of learned to say, okay, you know what, don't take on too much. You're going to be feeling a lot. It's not just when my mother died, but it's also her birthday month. So her birthday is the 15th of January, which was just this past Sunday. And then today is the day she died. And then there's the official death date, because sometimes that's not always the same, depending on the circumstances of how you learn out, depending on the circumstances of how you learn about the death. And it's also often Chinese New Year. So there are a lot of January dates. But I would say like 10 years on, it is a lot about celebrating. Sunday was her birthday, and we did all these things that are like meaningful around her and about her. So my husband and I walked down to the river here in Lisbon. It was a beautiful day, and she loved views of the water. So I really, really want to go down to the river. And we bought flowers. She loved flowers, and we threw like a tulip in the water for her and kind of dedicated that to her. We got some Portuguese pastries, pastéis de nata, like the egg tarts, like the original Portuguese egg tarts, and we had those. Food's very important. And I did some red ribbon dancing. So if you're curious,
Share. I'm a little bit. I'm curious. Yeah.
so I'm actually putting together like a mini exhibition on the Grief Gallery, like a virtual exhibition about red ribbon dance, because it's so significant in meaning to my mom and to me. So what I did on Sunday was I actually had like a ribbon, like it's really hard to do in a small bedroom.
Yeah.
It's this motion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying
And
not
is
to
that
knock
something
it
you
knocked over.
do? You did like individually, just to sort of have that time with yourself and your mom, and to do that practice.
It was a practice that I started doing instinctively. So the connection with my mother was that she moved to New York from Hong Kong when she was a teenager, and then that was in the 60s. And then in the 1970s, she and her group of friends were all exploring Chinese identity. And one of the ways that they did that was they founded a dance group that shared and explored Chinese culture through dance. So I have all these photos of my mother doing ribbon dancing and other kinds of Chinese dances. I have vague memories of taking some of the classes. My mom actually opted to put me in ballet instead of Chinese dance, which is interesting. But that was the significance for her, and she was very proud of that. And at her memorial, I really wanted to have a Chinese ribbon dance performance. It wasn't possible. The dancers were not available. Her memorial was in a Chinese restaurant. There were all kind of logistical challenges to that. So what I wound up doing, though, was a couple of months after she died, I was on a trip in Brazil. This had been planned before she died. Her death was so sudden. And I was actually planning her memorial during this trip, which was difficult on multiple levels. And I thought that I would go to a beach and just cry and scream, because I really hadn't done that. I had just been in such a state of shock and taking care of things, but I didn't. Like I went to the beach and was like, okay, bring it on.
Here we
And
go.
yeah, I'm ready. There's no one around. And it didn't happen. But somehow I had thought to bring a red ribbon with me, and I danced on the beach. And my very patient husband took photos of me doing that. And I just kept on doing it. So I've done that on Mother's Day in New York, where I actually hired a photographer and I danced and took photos at South Street Seaport. I've done that in multiple places in Portugal. I've done that in Indonesia. So I don't know, it was like creating a way to remember her in my very particular way. So yeah, celebrating ways that are like meaningful to her and to me. And I like coming up with my own rituals. That there is a gallery of some of the different places and the different times, though I don't know where the photo of that original occasion in Brazil was, because that was 2013, that year that I don't really remember on a lot of levels. And even photo wise, I'm like, oh, I think maybe I was using a different device. So my photo archive is almost like a reflection of my mental archive of saying like, oh, I don't actually remember what that first Mother's Day was like. I don't actually remember what the first holidays were like. I think it was just all such a blur. So I will have photos from the subsequent photo shoots, and it's also telling a bit about the story that I just shared, which I hadn't really explored before, about my mother's connection to dance, about how she put me into dance classes when I was 3 years old, and how that mutual love of dance was a connection that we had. So it's been interesting just putting that together today and reflecting on all those different connections. And I think every time I do this, I uncover more layers about my mother and about our differences and our similarities and our connections. So yeah, I'm excited to put this together.
I'm excited for you. This is really beautiful. And it sounds like, and we'll talk a little bit about this in your process in your work, but it sounds like there is this thread in your work of grief not only being the subject, but also processing grief and sitting with grief and thinking about grief is a part of like doing the work and going back to these moments that you experienced grief where it was maybe a little bit of a blur or where you were capturing things. And I think that's really beautiful. And also it's just so clear to me and always has been like how deeply embedded your personal experience is and sitting with your personal experience. It is ingrained and embedded in everything that you do with your work.
Yeah, it's very much been a part of that processing. Thinking of 10 years back and feeling so much compassion for myself 10 years ago and experiencing that shock of getting the news and then figuring out what do I do now. And I'm so grateful that I did have these creative outlets and that I listened to what my body needed, because I often think, oh no, I'm very much like a cognitive processor, but actually my body did know you need to dance. Go dance this out. Do some interpretive dance. Put them sad songs on and go dance around her empty house and process it that way. And I also think that's the beautiful thing about art, right? Like sometimes I think about, why is a museum and a gallery, that's my happy place, but it's also like my sacred place. And I did not grow up with a religion. I'm not religious. But when I think about the way that people talk about how they feel closer to God or closer to the universe, that for me, that's always been a museum. That's always been going to an exhibition and seeing a piece of art and feeling something. And yeah, it's this process that feels very natural and accessible to me. And I have to credit my mom and my parents for that too, because they took me to museums when I was really young. Like I have memories of going to the Louvre and going to Paris during the summers, because my father was a professor, so he had summers off, and they loved art. So I have photos of me as a little kid with sculptures and my mom next to me, and I think they really instilled that familiarity and that access to art at a young age. So I'm so glad that I have that as a resource.
Yeah, and it sounds like building and offering you the access, like you said, to build a connection with art that for you, it sounds like took on potentially like a very emotional, like pseudo spiritual just connection to something that is
Mhm.
now a space that you can feel deeply connected to when you walk into it. And this is beautiful. I want to ask you this question just because I would love to sort of take us from the beginnings of your work and the death and loss of your mom into where you are now. And so I'd love to hear a bit about why you got into the work that you're doing today.
You know how come Golden Girls and Sophia would be like, picture it. So picture it. January 2013. I'm in London. I get the news that my mom's dead. And I book a flight because being an only child, I knew I would have to take care of whatever happened. And I had my aunt to help me, but really I knew it would be on me. So I flew to New York and I wanted to go straight to her house. It was almost like, take me to the scene of the crime. I want to figure out what happened because it was so sudden. And this house was my mother's dream house. She had divorced my father a couple of years before she died, and she had moved back to New York, which was really where her friends were and her network was. And she had bought and expanded this house by the lake. It was about an hour north of New York City, and it was really her dream house. And it was full of stuff. And I had the task of deciding what to do with the house and all of the belongings in the house. I tried to keep the house. I paid the mortgage on it for over a year while I tried to decide. And then I decided I had to sell it, which means I had to empty it, which meant actually making decisions about what to do with all of her belongings, which also included books and my stuff in the attic, because she was also our permanent address. So there were a lot of decisions to be made, and I was very ill equipped to be making these decisions. I'm very attached to stuff. I love objects. That's why I have so many stuffed animals. That's why I pick up things and inanimate objects, and I think they're so cute and assign personalities to them. So with my mom's stuff, after she died, she had a lot of cute little tchotchkes everywhere, and it was just like, oh no, my mother chose that item. My mother placed that McDonald's toy on the shelf. We can't touch it. But I had to, and it was getting dire. I was adding up the costs of how much I was paying on the mortgage and everything, and my husband really did not understand why it was taking me that long. And in that moment, I really leaned into in that moment, I really leaned into my creativity, and I thought, you know what? What if I put on my curator hat and said, okay, if I was to do an exhibition about my mother, which 100 objects would I choose to display? Because that's what I'd been doing in London. I was able to make choices then. So by borrowing that kind of lens, that creative lens, that curator lens, at first it was an imaginary exhibition. Though I was looking at the storage unit at the start of 2022, and I found one box that actually had a label on it that said 100 objects. So I had actually, done the thing that the people in HGTV say to do, and I had labeled things donate, trash, keep. But I had a box that said 100 objects. And I love that I did that. I love that I leaned into it because I did manage to sell that house. And some things had to go into storage. I kept more than 100, I'm sure. But I think it was really like a creative thought exercise that got me going. But that imaginary exhibition became a real physical exhibition. October 2015 was the exhibition that I did in London featuring my mother's belongings. And that was really the seed for looking at grief through this lens of exhibitions, not just in our heads, but physically. And that was the seed for the Grief Gallery. The Grief Gallery is the project that I have where I do exhibitions about grief and death and loss. And sometimes that's online and sometimes that's in person. And often we feature the belongings of loved ones. Sometimes my mom's, often my mom's, but I also invite other people to bring in their objects and belongings as well.
What did you learn through the process of doing this work and starting the grief gallery? What did you learn, or maybe how did it help you expand the way you think about your own grief and also the grief of others? Because you do work as well supporting folks through grief. So I'm curious about sort of, yeah, what changed, expanded, grew in terms of how you think about grief?
It's both so personal and so universal. I mean, when I talk about the problem that I had with my mom's belongings and not being able to let go of them, so many people recognize that. So it's a common problem of having to go through the things, and some people only have a couple of days to go through the things. I feel so privileged to have been able to keep that house for that long. I mean, even though not financially prudent, but I support my decision to do that. And but I think my solution was unusual to do the exhibition. So that's been interesting to see how telling my story of how I solved for this problem, how it resonates with other people. And by starting to do that during the exhibitions, right? I would do the exhibitions, tell my story, share my mother's objects kind of as an invitation for other people to share their stories. And it was really interesting to see how just hearing my approach and doing some sharing of their own, I had people saying, I feel so much better. I feel so inspired. I feel like I can tackle my father's house now. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I know that story is powerful. I know that from my work background. And that's interesting that that can translate to helping people with grief. And I did want to help people with grief. I've always wanted to help people. That's something that my mother and I shared. And my mother, when she died, she was training to be a social worker. She had changed careers and she so wanted to help people. And I think that is one of the sad things that she didn't really get to do as much of that as she wanted. Though in going through some of the documents, I found newspaper clippings from the Chinese newspapers with photos of my mother giving talks about happiness, about grief, about end of life planning. And she was doing this specializing in working with Asian populations, Asian immigrant populations. So it was really interesting to see how, oh, we both wanted to help people in similar ways, just in very different modalities. So that's part of why I did my work shift from communications consulting for creative brands and design brands to, oh, let's talk about dead people and their stuff. And let's talk about how we can look at it in different ways and how we can put them on display and how healing that can be. So to me, they're connected. But when I did that business change, that was confusing for a lot of people. Yeah, I appreciate that. I spoke to, actually, on my mom's birthday, I spoke to one of my oldest friends, and she was one of the first people. She was one of the first people I told when my mother died. And she was very fond of my mother. My mom had kind of like adopted her a little bit as her own daughter too. And she kind of said that. She's said, "Oh, it all seems to make sense, and it's nice to feel that way." Like I was goth in high school, so I'm like, oh, at an early age, I was getting very familiar with death and these concepts and dark thoughts. But yeah, being able to bring in different ways of looking at things, and then for my journalism training, ways to look at stories and pull out stories from people and consider different ways to tell stories. That's been really interesting to look back at what I did and wonder, why was that so effective? Why was that so healing for me? And to find the connections to contemporary grief theory, that there are aspects of this idea of curating and putting on exhibitions and telling stories about our loved ones that connect to narrative therapy concepts from there, that connect to meaning reconstruction and meaning making as these ways of looking at grief and what people might want to do as they're processing their losses. So it's been really gratifying to realize, oh, what I did instinctively, creatively, and what I pulled from my background, and then from my coaching training, and then my continued grief training, it does all blend together, which is really nice. Maybe it's like a collage or a painting.
A collage is cool. I'm down for a collage, and I think it all, to me, too, feels so not just like cohesive and like it fits together, but a really incredible way to be doing this work with so much context from your own background, and also so many things that are like very rooted and grounded in other folks' work. Like it's just really special. I do have a question to sort of piggyback off of that and this concept of curation. And my question is, so a lot of your work is rooted in this concept that we can all be curators. That like I could walk into, when my dad dies, into his house, and I don't have my curator hat like you do, but I could have a version of it as someone who's going to have to go through the many things that are in his home. So can you just speak a little bit more about this concept of like what it means for all of us to potentially be curators as we're navigating death and grief?
Yeah, I think there is that aspect of making it accessible. When we think about what's accessible, that's always driven me. So that idea of helping people to be more literate about grief, because it's this thing that we will all experience, and yet we learn nothing about it in school. We don't really talk about it. To me, curating is the same, or it's similar. Usually, when people think about curating or being a curator, they think about, oh, you have to work for a museum or you have to work for a gallery. But that's not necessarily the case. And I was working as an independent curator, but also we've seen how the word curating has been used in all these different contexts.
So I have a question about that because when I think about curation, the thing that comes up for me in terms of our items and our things is that we might have to make choices about things that we keep and things that we can't or we don't and choose not to. So, what would you say to folks that don't feel ready to let go of all of their person's things, but who do feel weighed down by the amount of stuff that they're carrying around and storing and keeping maybe in a dead person's home or in their own home? What would you say to those folks?
Yeah, and that's really common. Some people I've spoken to have said, I have an apartment that maybe they were in the same situation that I was in, where they've kept it for a while because they couldn't do anything about it. Or more often, it's a storage unit that people have kept for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and didn't know where to start. And just like I talked about the physical stuff and the emotional stuff, I think an object has a meaningful object, let's say that, an object or belonging from your loved one that has that emotional charge for you. It has physical weight and volume, but it also has emotional weight. So if we're not ready to deal with the physical form yet, maybe we can start looking at the emotional form, the emotional shape of it, the emotional weight. And part of what's really helpful is noticing how there's also the emotional weight of judgment, shame, guilt. For some people, that looks like shame that they haven't been able to look at the things and let anything go. For other people, they think, if I let that item go, it means I'm going to forget my grandmother. That's emotional weight. That is emotional meaning and judgment about ourselves. So I always like to start one with compassion for wherever we are in this process with the loss and with the stuff. And then to shift to curiosity. And that's where I like the creative thought exercises. It helps us to shift into curiosity. Why does this object have so much emotional charge for us? What are some of the potential judgments and self judgments we have about it? And I think having that curiosity and that awareness is really the first step to being able to make any choices. We can't make choices about things if we don't even know what we're looking at or what we have. So, compassion, curiosity, start there.
For you, I was thinking about this the other day. There are things that like I got rid of my mom's, and I don't. There are certain things that I do have some regrets about. There are other things that I'm like, I'm sure I got rid of so much stuff that I'll never think about again that I haven't thought twice about. And I'm curious how you navigate and sort of what you tell yourself, what you sit within yourself when it comes to things that you made a choice to let go of versus the things that you kept and like very intentionally, like you said, kept and curated as the belongings, the physical belongings of your mom that you've kept and held on to.
Do you mean the things that I let go of that I wish I still had? Or
That maybe you wish you still had, or maybe you have a practice of like once you let go, are you like, I just don't, I haven't thought about any of the stuff that I've let go. Like, I'm just curious about what sort of your experience has been like having to let go of things.
For me, there isn't actually that much that I regret. What I kind of wish I had been able to keep is the house itself. My mother had actually said before she died, just kind of offhand, I don't know if she phrased it as if anything happens to me, but try to keep the house. So I think that's part of why I wanted to hold on to the house, even though it didn't make financial sense or logistical sense for me. And it really took talking to one of her old friends who had actually been in that Chinese dance troupe way back when. And she and her husband said, that was your mom's dream house. It's not your dream house. It's okay to let it go. And getting that permission from her was very helpful. And I think it's also giving ourselves permission to let that go. In my case, of course, I lean into creativity. So I commissioned an illustration, a series of illustrations about my mom. And this one particular one is her dream house by the lake. And it's like the view. I told the illustrator about it, the view of the swans, the view of the lake, the trees. And she did this beautiful illustration. And I feel like it captures it so well. And I can access that feeling of safety and comfort of being in that house when my mom was there, how she would cook for us every Christmas when we would go home. And then even after she died, her house became this safe space for me to dance, to process through her stuff or through whatever. But her house became that safe place. So I really enjoyed commissioning. But there is a lot of grief. There is a lot of grief of letting go of items. That definitely comes up where people had different circumstances. I mentioned how some people only have a couple of days. And as I've been working with more clients in different circumstances, you realize there are all these different circumstances that can add to the complexities and add sometimes to the pain of that loss, where my problem was that I had to make all these decisions. And other people, their pain comes from not having any choice. Maybe they lost their mother or parent when they were a kid, so they didn't get any choice. Maybe things got thrown out and they didn't get to keep anything. So that's been really heartbreaking and also interesting from a coaching perspective to see that range of experience. I would say that if you are longing for something, one of my sayings is the belongings can reveal the longings. If you find yourself longing for something, again, let's get curious. Why are you longing for it? What are you longing for? What feeling do you think you might have if you had it again? And what are some other ways to get that feeling? And that's an example of that kind of creative thought exercise that I use a lot with clients because we think it's the thing. And yes, the thing is so precious to us, but it's not actually about the thing. So there are all kinds of creative ways that I think we can create that for ourselves.
I love that. First of all, I love the commission. I don't know why, it made me extremely emotional. I don't know why I'm gonna sit with that, but there's something so different about that than what I know some people do is like they'll just take a photo of the thing and then they'll have like an album and they'll be able to look and remember the thing, but they got rid of the objects and all they have is a photo album. There's something very different about someone hearing your story about a space and being able to illustrate a memory and a feeling in such a different way. So that's just really beautiful. And I'm like, I need to do this. That sounds really special. But also just this comment, comment that you made in this concept of it's not always about the thing. There's something much deeper connecting you to that tangible object. Oh, I love this. I love this.
That's actually something that I've been exploring and investigating because I love commissioning. That's something that I did as a curator even before all this happened with my mother. And I'm exploring why is the act of transforming, like capturing it and transforming it into something beautiful and shareable, why is that so powerful? Because you're right, people, the professional organizers, they say take a photo, and I'm like, oh, this is an ugly photo I never want to share with anyone. That doesn't seem to be helpful for me. So there is something about the transformation. And even if I have it, there's something about that. I recently shared this at my monthly grief gathering, and that's where I invite people to bring an object and to tell the story about it. And this is my mother's scarf. It is a silk turquoise scarf. It is not my style, but it was one of her favorite scarves. And when she died, I found an essay that she had written for when she went back to school to get her bachelor's degree. And she wrote about the scarf and how it was her favorite because her best friend, Margaret, had given it to her when they were in high school together. And in looking through her things, actually during that first exhibition that I did in London, I had brought a pile of documents to kind of look through because it kind of felt like this is now evidence of something that was important to my mother. And I found this photo of my mom and Margaret, and my mom's actually wearing the scarf. And as part of that series of illustrations from the same illustrator who did this, I actually had them printed in different sizes. This is postcards, so I can give them away during events. I also had her do an illustration of my brother's collection of scarves, including that turquoise scarf. And I think there is something about taking it from this very personal individual item, putting it into an illustration makes it more abstract and accessible, where people can say, oh, my mother didn't have that scarf, but she had her own collection of scarves. And I think there is something about that transformation of the piece, the abstraction of the piece, that makes it more accessible on different levels. So I'm still exploring that part, but it's really interesting.
I love this. And I am so touched by what I think you're saying. My mom was a scarf lady. She had so many scarves, Charlene, like just so many scarves. And it's been, I think, just really touching and interesting to think about the fact that like I didn't keep a lot of them just because I don't wear scarves the way she wore scarves. But when I see not just the scarf itself, but that illustration, something about the collection and a depiction of that, exactly what you were describing happens for people, just happened for me where I'm like, yep, that was my mom. She had a collection. They were varied, they were different textures. I can see them, I can feel them, I can see pictures of my mom in my mind with the different scarves. And there's something very, very different for me about accessing those memories versus having them hanging in my closet in a place that I would probably never touch them. And yeah, this is beautiful. This happens every time I talk to you, but I'm just like deeply moved by the ways that you are exploring. How do we access these feelings? How do we access these memories? How do we access what I think is even a piece of me right now, like a piece for me of healing, which comes often when I'm able to have positive memories of my mom, which aren't all of the memories that I have. And I feel like there's just this, yeah, there's this beauty and something just really touching me about your work right now, which, like I said, it always does. But
Yeah. How do we access it? And how do we tell the stories? Tell the stories from the place of where you are now, right? It's not like I only pull out this scarf when I'm feeling really sad and I'm really missing her and I dig it out of the box. But now I get to pull out this scarf when I'm sharing the story about my mother from this place 10 years on, where I'm talking about her and feeling about her in this really loving and kind of celebratory way. So, yeah, being able to tell the story from the different points of our lives and the different points of our grief. I think it's really interesting. I love your enthusiasm. Thank you.
my last question for you today is how does your own identity and race and culture factor into the ways that you approach all of this work that we've talked about you doing today?
It's been a really interesting process of exploring that more and embracing it more in terms of my identity as a Chinese American. Because I think when it comes to grief and loss, there was a lot of rejecting the ways that Chinese culture traditionally deals with death and grief and loss. From, when I was 5 and my grandmother died, there were really weird experiences of secrecy and hiding and not showing your emotions that didn't sit right with me. So when I started doing the grief work, I really did kind of reject a lot of it, because it didn't feel supportive. My mother died right in the lead up to the Lunar New Year, which is a very important holiday, and there are a lot of superstitions around it. So there was a lot of don't tell people because it's unlucky. People don't want to be talking about death around the Chinese New Year. And my uncle died last year, also right in the kind of went into the hospital during the Chinese New Year. And again, that was a very loaded experience. And he really did not want to go into the hospital because it was the Lunar New Year. So my experience has generally been that the traditional ways of approaching it are not supportive. But in exploring this year, different ways to integrate red ribbon dancing, to integrate the color red, to integrate Chinese envelopes, those are a good thing. I do have a good memory of these. I think it's been an experience of seeing, okay, are there elements that I can embrace? And that idea of collaging. Are there elements that I can take and collage and kind of remix into my own rituals, into my own ceremonies, into my own approach of dealing with grief? And that has actually felt really creative and really supportive. And I encourage people to do that remixing, to look at what you want to take with you and what you want to discard. And I've had people say that, oh, actually, in the absence of having a religion, or in the absence of having decided not to continue with my childhood religion, that having this experience of putting together an exhibition, whether it's an imaginary one or whether it's an actual virtual one, which is something that I'm starting to do with clients more, that gives them those rituals and those ceremonies that they don't have because they do not adhere to a certain religion. So it's been really interesting exploring that about what aspects of Chinese American culture and what I was raised with do I want to bring forward with me, and which ones, like, I'm just going to choose to discard those. So I think that's like another aspect of curating that's been really interesting.
It's really good to hear too of this sort of journey that you're on with it, right? It's not like you just fell into something that you felt forced or obligated to do or work into the process of like navigating grief in your mom's death. It sounds like you found a path and you're finding a path and figuring out how to incorporate things that feel natural to you.
Yeah, it's a creative exploration, right? Well, if we say compassion and curiosity, let's throw in another C. I love C words. Creativity, accessible, and like a playful exploration of, what can be like a very difficult and dark and heavy subject for a lot of people. But I think when we approach it through that creative lens, that curiosity lens, people seem much more open to it.